through stories of resilience, finding gratitude in the echoes of grief. Together, we transform sorrow into strength, pain into purpose. Welcome to the Grief Grantor, where your healing journey begins.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Grief Grantor. I hope that you all are doing amazing. I am Portia Booker, your host, and also your grief awareness advocate. Also, you guys, to follow all my amazing adventures and, of course, keep up with all things grief, follow me on Instagram at Portia the Grief Grantor. So, you guys, I had something interesting happen. I always love to dispel words, right? I'm somebody who I went to Catholic school and I took Latin and Spanish at the same time. Those of you who may or not know that history lesson. So I had somebody tell me, how can you find gratitude in adverse circumstances, right? So I'm going to really touch on that right now. When we look at the word adversity, right, it comes from the Latin, which stands for adversus, which when you look at that, the word means to go toward. Right? To go toward. And it's the same thing with the word addiction. Addiction comes from Latin, which it says adicere. It's called, that's the word in Latin, adicere, which stands for a sign. So when we think about these two words, when we look at the way that we're using them in the English language, we tend to put what I call a negative connotation with both of these words, right? But in realistically speaking, those who have an addiction challenge or those who have faced adverse circumstances, why don't we take these words and instead use them as a way for us to make ourselves better? Right. I know in my journey, those of you who know, I've lost both my parents in the last year. And I also have my own mental health journey as well. Some of you who have followed me since 2016, 2017 know about my journey from my TV career to being diagnosed with bipolar disorder and almost ending my own life by suicide, and then leaving the business in order to really focus on my health. And when I think about that time of my life, I'm super grateful for the adverse challenges that I faced during that time, from when I would be in the newsroom and have little different outbursts or have moments where I felt as though I was disconnected from people, or even during my own grief journey, during that time where I was so focused and fixated on being this big time producer and working my way up the corporate ladder. And even though that journey didn't work out the way that I wanted it to, it gave me the opportunity to, number one, find gratitude in the journey, find gratitude in the fact that I didn't end my life over suicide, but instead I found a new life during that time. Number two, building resilience, right? I started talking about my mental health journey. I started talking about the different aspects of my life that very few people did not know. They thought I had it all together, right? Social media tends to depict this amazing image of us being what I call the Barbie doll special. Everything is plastic on the outside, but on the inside, you're crumpling. The other thing that helped me to do was be innovative in how I went about talking about my grief journey, right? Because when I think about how in our society, mental health still has various layers of tabooness along with grief, right? I thought I was going to go back to school, become a mental health therapist, and help people by working with them one-on-one. But instead, my way of helping people is through conversation. Conversation is how we overcome. Stories are how we learn how other people have gone through adverse circumstances. And in turn, it puts us in the position of the character in our own life, right? Number four, right? Being empowered through my journey, right? I can't tell you guys how many people have come up to me and they're like, Portia, I lost this person in my life too. I lost my dream job, right? So this is why I'm so big on sharing my journey. And number five, forgiveness, right? Forgiveness is not for the other person. It's for you. I'm going to say it again. Forgiveness is not for the other person. It's for you. And I talk about forgiveness a lot because if the God of our understanding, those of you who believe in God, the Buddha, whatever it is, if they can forgive us for the things that we do, why do we hold on to so much unforgiveness in our life? Right? So think about that as you go about your day. So when we look at, again, the word adversity and we look at the word addiction, those two words, think about their meanings, right? Addiction comes from Latin, which means to assign. Adversity or adverse comes from Latin, means to go toward, right? What if the circumstances and situations that we're going through in our life are giving us the opportunity to add verses of wisdom and tools into our toolbox in order to share them with other people to help them to stop making the cemetery wealthier with the goals, dreams, and aspirations that were not fulfilled. So we're going to take our first quick break right here on the Grief Grantor Show. When we come back, we will have a very special guest today who will dive more into the journey of addiction and her journey of helping other people through their, what I like to call, obstacles and challenges dealing with their own substance uses. We'll be right back here on the Grief Grantor.
Hi guys, I'm Noelle Agape, host of the Soul on Fire show. Join us every Wednesday at 3 Pacific Standard Time on the Vitality channel here on E360 TV.
All right, everybody. Welcome back right here on the Grief Grantor. Before we went to break, I mentioned about, again, the power of words that we use, right? Really taking the words addiction and adversity and really changing the way that we use them, right? Addiction comes from the Latin, which means to assign, and adversity or adverse comes from the Latin, which means to go toward. So how can we find a way to take this assignment of our life and go towards it in a empowered way and really work on ourselves from the inside out? So today I have the opportunity to be joined by an amazing individual who we met on Instagram. I actually, literally, when they started liking my post, I found the opportunity to call them, and this is where we are today. So her name is Stephanie Lama. She is the founder and owner of Unified Behavioral Health LLC, where she focuses on working with individuals who are overcoming substance use issues. So welcome to the stage, Stephanie. How you doing today?
Hi, Portia. I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Stephanie, I extend my gratitude, for you answering the call for me. I mean, you're probably like, who's this random person calling me from the internet? It's like, hey, I'm going to pick up the phone and call, right?
I love that, though. It's moments like that that make you, again, be grateful for all these random opportunities. So it's always great.
You never know, right? It's always like when we talk about where we see the different, it kind of reminds me of the story of the guy in the boat, right? He's asking God for a sign to help him, right? But God sent him like 8 different signs and he ended up drowning, right? And instead, you took the call. You're like, okay, why not? So
There you
Stephanie,
go.
I'm going to go ahead.
Oh, no.
Stephanie, I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to dive right in because, one of the things that I know, especially since we're in the holiday season, a lot of people are in this boat of grief, right? Grief from the fact that loved ones are no longer present, or grief that the traditions of the holidays have changed. And, as I mentioned in the beginning, that I'm grateful for my journey of where I am today. So, Stephanie, I know in your work, you work specifically with individuals who are working through addiction, right? And let's be realistic, loss can be a very challenging thing for you personally and also for their families when the addiction takes them over. So I'm curious, Stephanie, if you can shed light on how do you find gratitude in your role as a therapist, number one, even when you're faced with the loss of a client to addiction?
That is such a great question, Portia. If you would have asked me this maybe a couple years back when I was starting, I probably wouldn't have had an answer. It took me, some years to get to where I am now and to be able to answer this question. It's really hard when you work with a high risk population, right? When I started this job, I actually started in Massachusetts. I worked at a methadone clinic. I came right out of my master's degree, just kind of like never having worked with such a population. I thought I wanted to work with kids. So here I am in, a methadone clinic, and it's kind of like you were just thrown in, full force. I didn't think that this is the role that I wanted to work with. And then I experienced my first client death to addiction or to overdose. That was so hard. And I don't think I could, at that moment, I was like, how am I going to continue this work? Right. It's how can I continue going through the loss of other clients, knowing that this is such a reality, right? I actually had to take a day off of work. I couldn't come the next day because it was just so hard. And I'm like, how am I supposed to then, meet with other clients while I'm myself grieving the loss of a client? Like in school, we learned that we have to be, just these stoic people, set all these boundaries, practice ethics, but we're human too, right? So I think it's important to recognize that. A way that I have navigated this, I saw this as, I could have seen this as two different things. Either this client experience ruins my career and just makes me never want to do this job and makes me retract back to my comfort zone and work with the easiest, that I thought, right? Or I could take this as an opportunity. And what I can see it now is what a gift that client gave me, because it was a gift that allowed me to continue on the challenges of supporting others, fighting for other people's recovery, knowing that the reality of the situation, but allowing me to also bring my human side to the work, which I think is so important for clients to see as well. And to know that, we grieve too, but there's also the chance of recovery and that you can continue the fight despite the circumstances. And I actually have another situation, which I think ties more into the gratitude component of it. Most recently, I did experience another client loss, unfortunately, to overdose. And she was a client that was really scared of losing me, to the point where she thought I was going to quit the job. She was always, that was a big fear of hers. Like, I don't never want you, to leave as a counselor, please. That was a big fear. Well, it ended up that she left me first because she ended up dying of an overdose. And again, I took that as an opportunity, like as a learning thing for me, right? Like I can grow from this experience. This is another gift that the client was giving me, because she finally gave me that opportunity for me to start what I've always been hesitant about starting, which is my private practice. Because finally, when that relationship ended, I felt kind of like, okay, maybe this is a sign that she's giving me to just do what I've been holding back these whole years, is just something that I was scared of, right? So just moments like that you transform the grief into like a gift. I see it,
And Stephanie, I love that you touched on a couple things. Number one, you found a way to, number one, be grateful for the gift that both of these clients have given you, right? It's, I'm sending my love your way for their transition, but really their transition was for your transformation in the long run, right? And I'm curious, Stephanie, for both of these clients who have made their transitions from this physical plane, right? What keeps you, and I'm always curious about this, how do you find harmony, right? And what I mean by harmony is you show up every day still, right? The first client didn't scare you away from the business. It brought you more to it. And what I mean by harmony is, how do you maintain the humanness, right? And not allow the politics that can come from being a therapist to overshadow your work.
100%. Yeah. That's a very interesting question, because I've navigated that throughout my years. At the beginning, I always thought I had to be, kind of like a blank slate. And I've actually become more human throughout my role. And I've learned that the more human, the more that you can show your true self, obviously in a contained way, I guess, or the more that clients can connect with you. You know what I mean? And I'm not afraid to tear up if I feel there's something sad going on, right? Like, I think that obviously I'm not like a mess, but I think just showing a side of yourself. So, because in a sense, I see it as me modeling that for clients, that it's okay to be able to allow yourself to be vulnerable in difficult moments, and moments that normally you would want to tear up about or, be sad about, right? Like, it's normal to show some form of emotion. I know that's a little controversial, like, oh, that's, people who like are in a professional standpoint who show emotion, is seen as like, or at least if you tear up or whatever, that's seen as, you don't know what you're doing, etc. But I'm pretty confident in what I do. And I don't think that's wrong at all. I think it can be appropriate in so many different situations, right? So also finding the harmony is knowing when to stop, knowing when I need to take a break myself, right? Knowing when, I need to kind of just take care of myself a little bit more. And that again is something that you can model to the clients that I work with. Hey, like I have to take today off. I need to take time to take care of myself. And I hope you do the same when you're going through something difficult, right?
Stephanie, I want to ask this. During that day that you took off when your first client transitioned, what was going through your mind? Did you feel like you failed them, and what was maybe some of the limiting beliefs that you had during that time?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I always go through like, okay, which is so normal, right? What could I have done different? What didn't I see? What are the signs that I didn't pick up on, right? I took time to kind of just question that and really just focus on the fact that there's nothing really I could have done. It wasn't my doing, the outcome wouldn't have been different otherwise. We like to think that, right? We like to think, oh, maybe if I would have said this, or maybe if I didn't cancel this time, or whatever, whatever goes through your head. But just taking time to myself and really just, being kind to myself. Being kind to myself, by the way, didn't come like straight off the bat. That's a thing that you learn to do over time. So I think I think that in itself got better the more, I progressed through this profession. At the beginning, I would say I was more hard on myself,
And, I'm glad that you brought that up, because you talked about vulnerability just a minute ago. And I feel like I haven't really heard too many therapists say that they can be very hard on themselves. Like, I know, depending on your style of working with your clients one-on-one, sometimes there can be a little bit of your like, hey, you need to, fix this, or you're going to be, 6 feet under. So I know sometimes that TLC can come off a little rough depending on who it is, right? But
Exactly.
I'm glad that you brought this up, Stephanie, because how can other therapists, right, who, whether they're working with clients who are overcoming addiction obstacles, or even other things, right? Maybe their professional environment can be a little too much for them, or they're ashamed about pivoting in their career and they really don't know, they're experiencing the grief of that. How can more therapists learn to be kinder to themselves during these seasons, and also outside of that, learn to be more vulnerable about their journey to build more of what I call the human connection with their clients?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's something to say about, well, what happens in therapist personal life too, right? Like, are we also having some form of separation between work and our personal life? I'm huge about that. Like, I love to do so many. Like, if a client saw me outside of work, they'd be like, "Who the hell is she?" Like, I'm completely like, I love doing so many different things. Like, I try my best to also not let work come home with me. Right. So that's a big question, is like, okay, what's their personal life looking like? Are they experiencing a lot of stress in their personal life? Can they work to also increase, some form of self-care outside? And I know that's kind of cliche, like self-care. I mean, they should know that by now. We're therapists. Like, we should all know that if we don't take care of ourselves, and how the hell are we going to take care of our clients? That's like a given. But a lot of times, what happens is we're also dealing with these agencies that are very, just the system works kind of against therapists sometimes. So a lot of burnout is so real. And it kind of really impacts the real work that we want to do with clients, because, agency requirements, just so much legalities, like so many things that get in the way of the passion of working with clients can really burn therapists out. So just questioning, like, what is it, that one thing that's, really hard? Like, why is it so hard to take risks? Like, what can help you kind of get to a place where, if you've been wanting to do something outside of, being in this agency that keeps you kind of in jail, I would say, or like in this locked up position, why haven't you done it, right? Like, what are things that can help you? And even big one here, therapists should see therapists. I'm a big proponent of that. We should ourselves be taken care of, right? So don't be afraid of also seeking help when you need it. Because if you're telling that to clients, but not practicing it yourself, then exactly, So that's a huge one.
And Stephanie, thank you for reiterating that, because some of my coaches, we always talk about this. A good coach has a good coach, right?
Yeah.
And I think an amazing therapist has another therapist who works with them through their own personal challenges, obstacles, right? And I feel like sometimes we forget that. And that, Stephanie, me and you will probably have to do a whole series about self-care, because there is what I like to call the idea of what self-care is, and then the actual what self-care looks like and feels like. So we're going to take our first quick break right here on the Grief Grantor, everybody. When we come back, we're going to finish our conversation with Stephanie. We'll be right back.
Are you ready to illuminate your path and embrace your true purpose? Welcome to the Secrets of Being retreat in the breathtaking landscapes of Costa Rica. Experience a life-changing journey, surrounded by the vibrant energy of nature. Make connections with like-minded visionaries and change-makers like yourself. Discover the power of love and light, as we dive into transformative workshops, guiding you to unlock your highest potential and radiate positivity. Connect with the wisdom of the earth, immersing yourself in the beauty of Costa Rica. Let nature inspire your journey of self-discovery. Awaken the visionary within, and let your light guide you to create a positive impact on the world. Join us at the Secrets of Being retreat and shine bright. Reserve your spot now and take the first step towards a purposeful, inspiring life. Embrace the secrets. Embrace your light. Embrace your being.
All right, everybody, welcome back right here on the Grief Grantor show. We are joined by Stephanie Lama, who is the founder of Unified Behavioral Health. And before we went to break, we were talking about how therapists, number one, should also have their own therapist. Number two, the importance of self-care and really finding that harmony between work and life. Stephanie, before we go into the next part of the show, if our audience wants to connect with you and learn more about your work, is there a website or social media handle you can share with us today?
Yes. So you can check www.unifiedbehavioralhealth.com. That's my practice information. It has my address, my number, things like that. And in that same website, there's two links, one for my Facebook page and one for my Instagram page. So those are ways that if you'd want to connect with me, you can. And on Instagram, I'm Unified Behavioral Health. So.
Excellent. So those of you who want to connect with Stephanie, you definitely can. Stephanie, let's pivot to, we're in the holiday season. And we touched on this in the beginning about how families tend to struggle with obviously the guilt when a loved one is dealing with an addiction obstacle, and if they experience a transition from that. So I'm curious, Stephanie, what advice can you offer these families, their friends, even their therapists who are like you? How can they transform that guilt into a more constructive and maybe a supportive emotion? Because I feel like it gets stuck, kind of like grief, right? Grief gets stuck in our body, from different external things. Grief does not always result from the physical transition, right? As I mentioned, we grieve when we pivot in a job. We grieve when we move out of state. We grieve when there's a friendship that ends. So how can they transform that grief, that guilt and grief too? How can they transform it and use it in a more constructive and supportive way?
I think that letting them know that it's, first of all, a process. I think as human beings, we want everything and we want it now. We want to feel better. We want to, just, speed things up. Like, we can't handle negative emotions, right? That's why we drink, but that's why we drug. That's why we self-destruct, we avoid, we do all these things, right? I think learning how to trust the process, because ultimately, when we try to fight things, I think it makes it worse, right? When we try to fight the feeling. So normalizing that it is going to be okay, or naturally it's normal to experience, any form of guilt when it comes to that. That comes with anything, right? Like, you could be the most Zen person and still feel guilt in certain situations. So first of all is normalizing it. And going through that process of, instead of trying to fight it, what is your process going to look like, right? Because giving them the hope that while it is a process, it'll get better, right? And holding on to some form of light at the end of the tunnel. But what needs to happen in the meantime, so that we're kind to ourselves through this process that's going to have to happen, right? Which is huge. I think a lot of times we don't really, like therapists, even as a therapist, we always want to see results. We want our clients to get better. We want, everyone to just, everyone just do what we say and you'll be fine. Like, no, it doesn't work that way. It's a process. So, and then the clients get frustrated when they don't see progress, and it's just this cycle of like frustration that doesn't make it any better. So like, how do we work through that process of accepting the fact that we will experience some form of guilt? And at the same time, where is this guilt? Understanding the guilt, understanding, how realistic is this guilt versus like, okay, how can we challenge that guilt a little more with maybe another type of reframing? Like, as I said, instead of seeing, oh, I did something to cause this client's overdose, what a gift this client gave me that, I could now take with me for the rest of it. Right? Like, those little types of moments can really help you, transform that. But it takes some sort of patience, right?
Stephanie, I want to ask this one-off question that just came to my mind. You brought up the word process, right? And how a lot of therapists are very results-driven. I want to see the process immediately. Kind of like when you're frying a pancake, and you can obviously tell when it's done. Obviously, the more firmer it gets, some parts of the pancake are going to be a little burnt. So you can tell that it's cooked, right? I'm curious, Stephanie, can you walk us through maybe how you measure that process working, right? Is it maybe one of your clients took the initiative to step out of their comfort zone? Maybe instead of them going for whatever their addiction obstacle crutch has been, maybe they did something different. How do you measure that processing for your clients and for yourself?
Showing up. As long as you show up for yourself, the process comes naturally, right? A lot of clients, after that really difficult session, they don't come anymore. Or I can't come, I'm sick, right? Like, that is the number one, right? If you continue showing up despite the challenge, that's huge in itself, because it shows you that no matter what, you are still, in the game, right? Like, you're still fighting for yourself. You're still showing up. That is huge. And I think naming that as well. I'm huge on naming, right? Like, let's name it. You showed up today. Thank you for showing up. This tells us here that you're invested in continuing to work through this despite it being really hard, and that encourages them to continue showing up. So also just seeing how that continues to look like, right? Like, what they're doing. Like, are they, noticing any changes? Are they talking about it, right? Are they closing up more? Are they opening up more? Like, what's going on with them throughout this journey, and naming it as well, right? Like, just kind of measuring that, and every session just kind of going over it and saying, hey, I noticed, let's look back, let's step out of the big picture and look at your timeline here. And it looks like you started here. Do you see the do you see where you are now? Like, can you see that progression? Sometimes we don't notice that. Sometimes we're in our own heads and we just live day to day without really stepping out and looking at, whoa, you're right. Like, I was a mess day one. I am kind of, in a different space now. So things like that, I would say.
Stephanie, you said my favorite thing, showing up. I mean, showing up hands down gets you into so many different doors. I mean, it really shows the power of resilience when you show up, whether it's messy. I had the opportunity earlier this year to speak at my alma mater, Kent State University. And one of the things that I shared with the students was the power of showing up. Show up when it's messy. Show up when it's not pretty. Show up when you got one sock that's blue, one sock that's red. Show up anyway, because you never know how you showing up is really paving the way for you to have progress, to show that progress, to show that you're really invested, that you're putting yourself first. And Stephanie, I want to ask this of you being a therapist, right? How do you measure your own progress, right? From where you started as a therapist to where you are now?
That's a good question. And I gotta have to think about that because, we're so good about highlighting everyone else. And then when it comes to us, we're like, deer in headlights. Like, what do I respond? My progress. What progress are you talking about, Portia? No, but I think it's I have to say this about myself. I feel more fearless the more that I go through this process. I used to have so many limiting fears that, would not allow me to be where I am now. I was scared. I always wanted to have my private practice. I always wanted to do this full time. I was scared and I just kept kind of staying in the safe zone for so long. A lot of my progress, I think, is measured by doing the work myself, like seeing my own therapist, as we mentioned, kind of, and just really challenging those fears and realizing that it's not as scary as we put it out to be. And even if it is, we can handle it. We're humans, like we can handle so much adversity, believe it or not, we're all capable. So just being able to step out of your comfort zone and seeing myself do it more and more. I think that's where I see it, like seeing myself, challenging myself a little bit more, just even with the clients that I'm working with, pushing them a little more, just doing things that I've noticed I would be more kind of reserved or more careful back then,
And I love that, Stephanie, that you brought this up because I think, again, you said it. We look at everybody else like, oh, they're doing amazing. They've stopped doing this thing that's holding them prisoner and now they're, on to something else. But we don't always stop to think about the progress that we've made in our journey to get to where we are today. Like, Stephanie, little digression. I didn't think I always wanted a TV show, right? I envisioned it ever since I was little. I'm definitely a big fan of Oprah. Oprah definitely inspired me to want to have a talk show to have these conversations. But I was terrified. I remember when I was in college and we had a class where we had to try out or audition to be on the TV network inside of the university. And I remember the first time I read from the teleprompter, I ran right out of the studio and hid in the bathroom. And my friend comes and she's like, Portia, you did amazing. You were just quiet, but you read everything amazing. You did great. In my mind, I thought I sounded like a dying cat being like just I thought literally my vocals were being shredded by the grater that you use in the kitchen. That's literally what I thought I sounded like. But everybody else said that I was amazing. But look at where I am now. I kept mustering through it. I stuttered through a little bit. I had a few wardrobe snafus, but I still came through. I still showed up. And I'm proud of myself for muddling through that. And like what you said about you having a therapist, I have amazing coaches who have worked with me on my delivery, how I show up, me investing in myself. And, and sometimes they're a little hard on me too, which I'm grateful. Y'all know who you are. I'm not going to name blast y'all, but I'm not going to
shout out to my therapist, right?
Right. There you go. They know, and so I really appreciate you highlighting that, Stephanie, because I think throughout our journey, right, where I was listening to this video earlier today where it talked about like how we're here to help people. Our success comes from helping other people. And I think sometimes we get so fixated on being hard on ourselves that we forget the real reason why we're doing what we're doing in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't say that better.
And when I thought about it in that way, I was like, man, I get to impact so many people instead of I should or I need. I get to really work with people and help them in some capacity. Like I said, Stephanie, I wanted to become a therapist like you, but the path just keeps getting, it's like what I call the line just keeps getting cut. It's not meant for me to go that route. This is the way that I'm helping people is through conversation. So, absolutely. Stephanie, I want to pivot a little bit. I know we talked about, obviously, you working with individuals who are working through addiction obstacles, right? We've given highlight to families and how they can pivot their mindset from the space of guilt to gratitude with their loved one's journey on this path, right? Stephanie, you touched on this a little bit, but I want to go more in depth, like with how when you embark on your grief journey, right? How do you navigate through your own grief while still showing up as the best version of you for your clients?
I think just initially, I mean, it's really, I guess it's hard, right? Because I've had very different experiences. I've had experiences where I've just, again, had to not come to work. But I think with that is being able to be honest with myself and check in with myself. I think a lot of times we want to fight through it and say, no, I got to show up to work and just, really pretend that I'm okay. Right. So checking in and saying, okay, how am I feeling about this? Like, what's this triggering in me? I got to say, like, my first grief experience was when my grandfather died. I think I was 11 years old, and it was so shocking because I never saw death. I never knew what that was. And he was so close to me, and I was actually with him the night that he died. Right. So it was devastating. I thought I could never recover from something like that. And I was like, there's no way. And just sometimes that gets triggered a little bit, like that whole, like, oh my God, this is something that, it's how do you just continue going from this? Like, and to do that personal check-in, I think is always important, just kind of taking the space that I need for myself and figuring out, okay, am I in a place where I feel like showing up for someone else right now? And I think it's depending on the person you're working with, also sharing that, right? Like, hey, this is my experience when it comes to the grief process. What is your experience? And, kind of figuring out if the experience that I can share can also help them navigate whatever they're going through. But it's hard. I'm not going to lie. Like, it's not just this easy peasy thing where you just get it. Sometimes you experience like a little regression and you're like, damn, Stephanie, like, you with a master's and all this, like, you thought like, you couldn't get it together at this point, but it happens, so just being kind to yourself, I think, and really understanding what's going on, checking in, versus just kind of trying to pretend that you got this when maybe you don't,
Stephanie, can you touch more on that? Like, you do your personal check-in. What do you ask yourself? Like, what really do you ask yourself when you're doing this personal check-in? Am I okay? What am I feeling? What does my grief want from me?
Mm-hmm. Right. Like, exactly. Like, what's going on right now? Right. Like, what doubts is this kind of bringing up in me? Right? Like, am I having any doubts related to the work that I'm doing? Like, am I, is this something that, have I been here before? Is this familiar? Right? And I'm not going to lie. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I'm like, to hell with it. Like, I gotta, so it's not always a thing that I go through, but it does. But when I do try to really check in with myself. Those are the questions that I ask. I'm such a doer, right? So for me, letting out energy is so important. Running is where all my thoughts come in. When I go for my runs, like it's like the best. You know how some people in the shower, that's where their thought. No, for me, it's like either running or doing something where my body's letting off some steam. I think that to me is super important. So really allowing myself to also do something like that and understanding like, okay, is this an avoidance technique or is this actually helping me? So checking in with that as well.
And Stephanie, let me ask this for individuals who are embarking on their own grief journey, right? Maybe they have a loved one has transitioned as a result of addiction or overdose. Or they're in, like I mentioned, we're in the holiday season where a lot of people, holidays are not always a happy time for people. I'm going to just say it. They're not always a happy time. Even for myself, this would be the first holiday season without both of my parents. Mm-hmm. So it's unique. But for me, the way I look at it, in my journey, I found gratitude in the traditions that they have given me, right? Yeah. Like for Thanksgiving, those of you who saw in my Instagram story that I made my family's homemade potato salad recipe and it got eaten up. So that should tell you right there that I made it identical to Granny's recipe.
Yeah.
But Stephanie, what maybe for the families, their friends, their loved ones, maybe what questions can they ask themselves to do a check-in, right? Because I think sometimes it's hard for us to see duality in grief. It's, as you mentioned in the beginning, it's a process, but we become very, what I call narrow focus.
Yeah.
Where this is how it looks, this is how it's always been. But in grief, you can be grateful and grieving at the same time. Yes. And so, Stephanie, for our audience, what key questions can they ask themselves to do a personal check-in? And how can they take their experience and empower others through their journey?
That's a great question. I think even writing it down, right? Having a list of things, questions that they can write down, like how am I feeling right now? What resentments am I holding to? Of course, when it comes to that type of grief, there's a name for it. It's called disenfranchised grief. I don't know if you've heard of that, but when there's more taboo like griefs where it's like either the grief of someone by suicide or, you know what I mean? Those types. So understanding that I think is huge, but also talking, asking like, okay, what resentments am I holding on? Am I ashamed? Is this bringing up some form of shame? Do I have a fear of sharing this grief to others, right? Like first kind of going through the real feelings that kind of sometimes limit us from actually experiencing the real emotion, because we try again to not want to deal with the most difficult things that, that are in this underneath the surface. But really just checking in, kind of going real deep, real with ourselves. Did I hold on to some anger? Did this, despite me going through the grief, there can also be anger towards the person that left. And what is the closure that I'm going to need as well? But at the same time, once we kind of go through that process, being able to, I like what you mentioned about you turning that into such a moment where, you attempted to make your mom's potato salad. I think that's beautiful, right? Like, and what are things that you can do to bring you some form of peace despite, the chaos that it is, right? Like, what is it that's going to help you kind of, either remember the person or, focus on the moments of, that were, amazing, like the fact that you gave birth to this person, you brought this person to the world, like whatever it is that's going to help you kind of reframe, the limiting thoughts that come, during this time. But it's not easy. It's not something that's, automatic, right?
Well, I agree. I definitely agree. And you're right. It is a challenge when we're so fixated on one part of the journey of the story. And in society, that's all we tend to see is you have to be sad when you're grieving. You have to feel resentment. You have to feel isolated. You have to feel emotional. You have to feel, as though you've lost your focus or your footing in life. You have to feel guilty. You have to feel the shame. There's all these things that society tells you have to feel when you're grieving. But I think duality is what truly helps us to learn in grief. And grief teaches us about duality if we're open to seeing it.
Absolutely. It's a complex process, right? It's not linear.
Yeah. We're gonna have to touch on that. We're gonna touch on the linearness when it comes to grief. We're gonna take another quick break right here, everybody, on the Grief Grantor. When we come back, we're gonna finish our conversation with Stephanie. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Sarah Stockham, and I'm host of Simply Sarah. Join me Thursdays at 3 p.m. Pacific on the Achieve TV network for the best energetic tools to elevate your amazing life right here on E360 TV.
All right, everybody, welcome back right here on the Grief Grantor. We were just having a great conversation with Stephanie about how we can really pivot and shift our mindset when we are going on a grief journey. Instead of just focusing on all of the guilt, the resentment, the isolation, the emotional impacts, and also feeling as though we've lost our footing, repivot our mindset to a space of gratitude, finding gratitude in this person being a part of our life and what they taught us, right? Building resilience by talking about our journey or expressing our journey. Also being innovative in how we help other people from experiencing the heavy effects of grief through conversation or through journaling, and also finding empowerment and also forgiving ourselves and other people for our actions and reactions from what we did and didn't know. So Stephanie, look, I know we touched on it before we went to break about the linearness of grief. How, as a therapist, are you empowering your clients to break out of that prison cell, because it really is, of this mindset that grief is linear, and instead helping them to cultivate a mindset of I'm allowed to feel guilty and also grateful at the same time?
I think it's also giving them that space. I think the therapeutic environment allows for that, especially if you have a trusting relationship where clients do feel safe. Because this room, I feel like it's the opportunity for people to just, get away from the external societal, family expectations that, consume them, to actually listen to something that helps them regroup and regain a sense of normalcy and of what they're feeling, right? And validation. So being in the space in itself, I think, is huge. And just providing what we call psychoeducation, right? Like educating them on what grief, what the concept of grief is, why it's such a complex process, why it's not a linear process, and even sharing your own experience through the grief process. Like, hey, one day you'll unexpectedly feel this way, allowing yourself, normalizing, right? That it's not going to you're not going to go from like denial to acceptance. I had one person once tell me, like, I will never get to the acceptance stage. How are you telling me that I'm going to ever accept something that I don't want to accept? That's complex because, but you know what I mean? Everyone goes through their process very differently, and that's okay too, right? Again, I think it's the concept of feeling like we have to subscribe to a norm that only makes it worse, because then we're fighting with this thing that seems bigger than ourselves, and it makes us feel then out of control and like we're doing something wrong, and it creates this vicious cycle, a negative feedback loop that's not helpful,
I love how you brought up acceptance just now, Stephanie, because I know for me, and I'm going to touch on this in my book, Finding Grace Within Grief, Her Transition, My Transformation. That's the first chapter I start with, is acceptance. Because whether we want to admit it or not, we've accepted this is the reality. This is the reality that this person is physically transitioning from this physical plane. That's the reality. The thing that I think that in our mind we don't want to accept is the permanence of this, right? The permanence of the fact that you're not going to wake up and see this person in a physical state, right? But this is where gratitude comes in, and being open to having another form of communication with that person that is beyond what society tells you. You're allowed to feel angry. Oh, I don't even want to. Anger, I'm going to say this to Stephanie. I don't know if you want to say anything on this, but I feel like anger is a very, very powerful emotion if it's used properly.
Yeah,
it can be very useful when you are angry. That's how I wrote my first book. I was angry. I mean, me and God, I was ready to have a boxing match in my front yard with the God of my understanding. And I'm telling you, Stephanie, I wrote him 2 letters. I wrote him the first one, and then I wrote him a second one. Because I'm like, you're going to hear me, sir. You're going to hear me and understand that I am not happy with you. And I said some things in there that, I'll be honest, I'm surprised that every Bible in my house didn't catch on fire. But we'll keep it at that. We'll keep it PG for here. Stephanie, I truly, I extend my gratitude for you for saying yes to be a guest on the show. And you shared so much with us. We're going to be wrapping up here soon. But before we, wrap up, if our audience again wants to connect with you and learn more about your work, can you share your social media and website again?
Yes. So it's Unify, UNIFY _behavioral _health. That is my Instagram account. You could just search for it, Unify Behavioral Health. My website is www.unifybehavioralhealth.com. In my Instagram, you'll see a couple of links that I share as well. So just clicking on those links will get you to more information about just me and how you can connect with me in some way.
Excellent. Stephanie, thank you so much. Stephanie, one of the things that I've built this show around is forgiveness. I've said it all the time that my father's absence taught me how to be present in my life. And as he was making his transition, I was able to forgive him because his Alzheimer's dementia really caused him to forget a lot of things that he did in his life and the things that he did in my life. And so I had to really ask myself, how can I hold this man who doesn't even remember his name anymore, all the great accomplishments that he's had, how can I hold him hostage in unforgiveness? And instead, I learned to forgive him. So, Stephanie, for our audience who's tuning in, right, in the realm of where you are with working with individuals to help them overcome addiction obstacles, right? And I think forgiveness is a powerful thing for both ourselves internally and for others. So how can you, or how do you even guide your clients towards embracing forgiveness? And what do you think that impact does for them in the long run on their recovery journey?
You said it at the beginning, you forgive others for yourself, right? Which is so important. When we hold on to forgiveness, or when we're not, forgiving, it does something to our bodies. We feel it in our bodies. We develop somatic symptoms, right? It is true. So I think making that connection with a lot of the clients that I see that don't have that capacity yet, that, connecting like, well, why do you think you're constantly sick, right? Why do you think, what's going on? You're holding on to something, right? What do you think it's doing to your body? And actually making that connection, because oftentimes we do experience it physically somehow, somatically, whether it is, right, a headache, like stomach issues, like IBS. It's known that there's a lot of roots with trauma and just a lot of stress. So what can we do to release ourselves from something that's hurting us physically? Okay, we're doing it and kind of connecting it like you're doing it not for someone else, but for you to be at peace, for you to get to that. And explaining that, I think, helps them realize like, okay, maybe you got a point here, because I didn't see it that way. I always thought if I forgive this, or if forgiveness in some way is equated to X, Y, and Z, something that I can never accept, right? So helping them reframe that forgiveness is not always meaning what you think. Forgiveness is not something that you're doing for someone else. This is something that's going to free you from this eternal prison that you've been in, So just allowing them to see that, making those connections, and then, doing that whole stepping out and seeing, okay, when you finally forgave, do you notice a difference? Are you seeing the difference that it has done to you in general? Have you seen how it's freed you in some way? Right. And I think that would be a good thing for them to see.
I love how you said it, how it's freed them in some way, right? Because when we forgive, we're not forgetting what happened, right? We're acknowledging, again, here's acceptance. We've acknowledged what has happened, and we're allowing ourselves to let go of the emotion from that. And in return, being open to what can be and what will manifest in our life from us letting go of something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, everybody, that concludes another episode of the Grief Grantor Show. And that was Stephanie Lama from Unified Behavioral Health that you heard from. And until next week, everybody, take care for now.
Thank you for joining us on the Grief Grantor. May the story shared today light your path and guide your heart toward healing. Remember, with every moment of grief, there's an opportunity for gratitude, resilience, and empowerment. Continue your journey with us online and share your own story, because in this tapestry of life,